Good morning, everybody. I'm Doug Bellamo. I work within the water business line at AECOM, and I'm excited to be moderating the showcase with you today. Thanks again, ASFPM, for demonstrating your adaptive capacity and bringing us all together here virtually. Thank you all for choosing to join us here at our showcase. Welcome to my wonderful guest bedroom, which is also a makeshift office here in Fairfax, Virginia. Also, welcome to several other locations as we sort of whisk you around the country and bring to you live AECOM experts who are part of our Technical Excellence Program. This program was established to ensure that as professionals within AECOM, we stay sharp, that we sustain our corporate capability to bring the most credible technical science and engineering to our clients. And today you're going to hear from several of the experts we have in that program. They're going to present their experiences, some challenges that they've overcome, and give us some glimpses into opportunities that lie ahead. So first, we're going to hear from Justin Vandever. He's going to be leading a discussion on building the local resilience to climate change. He's going to overview some of the strategies that he's deployed, share some of the tools and data, highlight some specific case studies. Following Justin will be Andy Bonner and several other colleagues who are going to be leading a discussion on new and innovative technological advances with respect to identifying flood hazards and risks. As importantly, he's also going to share how these technologies are helping floodplain managers and flood risk managers. Last but not least, the third session will be a very timely one. Laura Adleman is going to be sharing with us new and innovative ways for engaging people in this era of social distancing. So each of the speakers is going to start by introducing themselves. Throughout the presentation, you'll have opportunity to answer questions, to ask questions. Just use the Slido function. We'll monitor that. Keep in mind, if you like a particular question you see pop up, just give it a thumbs up and it's going to elevate, naturally float to the top. So with that, let's get started. Justin, take it away.
Great, thank you, Doug. So let's get going here. All right. So as Doug mentioned, my name is Justin Vandever, and I am a coastal engineer and climate adaptation specialist with AECOM based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm also the climate science lead as part of the Compass Technical Excellence Program. And I'm going to be talking to you today about building local community resilience to climate change. So just a quick review of some of the goals and objectives of my presentation. The first is to review the effects of climate change on local flooding, and also to share some data sources, tools, and methods that local communities are applying across the country to better understand how climate change will affect local flood hazards within their communities. And then also to share some best practices and lessons learned. We'll go over a few case studies and share those with you to give some examples. When we think about climate change, it's helpful to think about sort of the broader context of future conditions, flood hazard analysis, and mapping, and recognize that some communities have been considering future conditions in their floodplain management for years, whether it's incorporating changes in land use and development into their hydrology and floodplain mapping, or implementing those regulations or additional freeboard into the floodplain management ordinances. So from that perspective, climate change is just an additional element to fold into those processes that are already being implemented. Fortunately, we have some great guidance from the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, which issued a report in 2015 on future conditions, risk assessment, and modeling, and includes some recommendations that are relevant for considering climate change. For example, producing and using non-regulatory future conditions flood risk products in coastal and riverine areas, recognizing that there is considerable uncertainty in future climate projections, particularly with respect to precipitation. And also recommending demonstration projects to test out new methods of analysis and mapping. So when we think about local flood hazards, we typically think about sort of three general categories. The first is coastal flooding, the second is riverine flooding, and the third is urban flooding, stormwater. And of course, we also know that these hazards are not mutually exclusive. They can interact with each other and build upon each other. So for example, you can have high elevated coastal water levels at the same time that you're having intense precipitation in the watershed or within an urban area. And climate change is going to affect, and in many cases, worsen these flooding processes within our local communities. And so a lot of communities now are looking at ways to consider climate change in their flood hazard analysis, mapping, and floodplain management. And so, there's a lot of great examples and new techniques that are being applied across the country. So what we want to do to sort of help me figure out which case studies we're going to cover later in the presentation, if we could, Kelly, start the poll here. You should see it on your screen. I want to ask which climate change topics are most interest to you. And if you could select your top two here, that will help us with the case studies. So we have sea level rise, vulnerability, risk, and adaptation assessments, coastal erosion and shoreline change, precipitation, watershed hydrology, and riverine flooding, and urban flooding and stormwater. So if you all could just make those selections, we can take a look later in the presentation as we go through the case studies. So sources of climate projection and data. Obviously, conducting climate assessments as part of flood hazard mapping requires a lot of information and data about future conditions. And fortunately, we have a lot of great information available for the different types of flood hazards that I discussed. So some of the data that's often required as part of these assessments is, of course, sea level rise projections. How will sea level change? How is it going to feed back and interact with the shoreline? In many cases, it may start to cause shoreline retreat or exacerbate retreat in areas that are already experiencing erosion. Watershed hydrology, so understanding how precipitation patterns may change and affect annual precipitation within a watershed, or affect the peak stream flow, so the 100-year discharge, for example, and also other impacts such as changes in snowpack and also wildfires, and thinking about how wildfires may change the landscape within a watershed and affect runoff patterns and flood hazards for areas that are downstream. Superimposed on top of all this is potential changes in storm frequency and intensity. And so along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, tropical cyclone intensity, frequency is of concern. And then on the West Coast, along the Pacific coast, atmospheric rivers are a primary driver of flooding in a lot of watersheds. And so understanding how those might change is also important. We have a lot of great resources in terms of data availability, all the way from the federal, state, down to the regional level. And so at the national level, the fourth National Climate Assessment provides kind of high-level overview of climate change throughout the country. NOAA provides projections of sea level rise. The EPA is one example of data available through an online viewer on projected changes in precipitation. And then at the state level, there's examples where states have issued their own sea level rise guidance for, sort of representing best available science for state agencies and entities working within the state. So California, Washington, Massachusetts, and others. And then getting down to the regional level in Southeast Florida, for example, the Southeast Florida Regional Compact has adopted unified sea level rise projections, which are really helpful for sort of ensuring consistency across a regional area. When we get to the step of actually analyzing, assessing, mapping these future flood hazards, there's a whole spectrum of approaches that can be applied. And I've shown some of them here, which we've applied on a number of different projects, ranging from low to high in terms of cost, data requirements, time, level of effort, and expertise required. And so at the simplest level, sort of GIS-based inundation mapping provides some great tools that can be used to perform high-level exposure assessments for situations where you need a little bit more refined approach. If you're looking at, say, overtopping of a levee or flooding of a low-lying area where the inundation maps may not provide the most accurate results, you can apply a hydrodynamic model and capture some more of those physics, to more dynamic modeling approaches, such as what's being done by the USGS along the Pacific coast and elsewhere with our Cosmos model, where you're considering all these feedbacks and capturing some of these complex processes that are not captured in some of these other methods. When looking at riverine hazards, some of the initial assessments just made very simple assumptions about how future floodplains might change. So this idea of using a floodplain proxy. So for example, saying, well, what if the 500-year floodplain, as mapped on the maps today, might be representative of future flood hazards, like maybe a 100-year or 200-year. So just using that to understand what's the larger extent potential of impacts from a flood event, to actually making adjustments to the future conditions hydrology. So applying information from the literature or maybe simplified analysis from downscale precipitation data at kind of like the watershed scale to make adjustments to peak flow events. And this is kind of where a nice tie-in with the next presentation that's being led by Andy Bonner, where that we see some opportunities to use some of this probabilistic data that's coming out of recent analyses to better understand sort of how flows and floodplain extents may shift in the future. So for example, maybe the 150-year event becomes the 100-year event and so on. And then of course, dynamic modeling, some of the more complex analysis of runoff, translation of changes in precipitation and snowpack. So USGS is doing some of this work in California, and other academic institutions are providing this. And so we're able to start incorporating some of this research-based output into our projects as well. At the local level, urban flooding hazards are important to understand as well. And so sort of simplified methods of understanding, just documenting, well, what are the existing areas that are experiencing flooding, and how might those, anticipate that those might become worse in the future. In some cases, we've used sea level rise inundation maps to identify these like kind of low-lying areas that might experience issues with backflow through the stormwater system or impeded drainage, areas that maybe are gravity flow now that maybe will have to become pumped in the future as a result of higher tidal water levels. And of course, you can apply a stormwater model as well. This is sort of the most cost-intensive effort, where you can apply sea level rise to the boundary condition, adjust the precipitation intensity within the area, and look and see how the stormwater hazards might change in the future as well. So I'd like to jump into some of these case studies and best practices and share some examples. And I want to start first with some local climate resilience guidance examples. So moving beyond sort of the analysis and mapping step and actually putting those results into practice. And so there's a lot of great examples around the country where local cities and counties have started thinking about how to incorporate climate change into their design standards and guidelines, for example, or considering climate change in capital planning guidance for how they make decisions about funding projects and what requirements might be placed on those projects to be sort of resilient to future climate hazards. And then also incorporating those elements into the floodplain management ordinance, for example, requiring additional freeboard above the base flood elevation. So these are some of the examples that have been applied throughout the country. And I think that if you look here, I just will leave this up for a second while we kind of look at the results of the poll. If you want to screenshot this, there's a lot of great examples available online if you'd like to see what might be applicable in your area. So based on the results of the poll here, it looks like we have a lot of interest in the sea level rise vulnerability risk and adaptation assessments, as well as the urban flooding and stormwater side of things. So that's great, and that gives me some guidance here on where we might start. And I think what I'd like to start with on the sea level rise front is a project that we worked on in Olympia, Washington, to develop a sea level rise response plan. So this was a really unique and interesting project because it was led by the city of Olympia, but really strongly partnered with the port as well as the wastewater treatment plant to look at how to respond to sea level rise and climate hazards within their downtown waterfront area. And so this project included a climate science review to look at riverine, coastal, and stormwater hazards, vulnerability and risk assessment. We developed a phased adaptation plan with costs. And one of the unique aspects of this project was that it really included quite a bit of public and stakeholder engagement. And one thing in particular that I want to highlight is something that the city actually did, where they posted a map on their website and created a self-guided shoreline walking tour so that residents could kind of walk the waterfront and look at some displays, and they had this brochure, and they could kind of learn about some of the strategies that were being developed and proposed as part of the plan, and see the flood maps and things like that. And so it was a really great tool to kind of share this information as the plan was being developed and kind of encourage people to participate in the process. So through this effort, we looked at sea level rise, high tides and storm surge, high river flows. The Deschutes River comes right into the downtown area and discharges into the southern end of Puget Sound, as well as potential for backflow through the stormwater system. So the strategies that were developed had to address sea level rise, wave, surge events along the Puget Sound shoreline, also riverine flooding, and then the interaction, like I talked about before, this interaction between high tides and riverine discharge and managing that. Some of the strategies included tide gates and valves to prevent backflow through the stormwater system. So a very comprehensive assessment. The way we structured the adaptation plan was that we divided up the study area into 4 focus areas. So I mentioned the port and the wastewater treatment plant were really core to the project. They cover a lot of sort of the area of the downtown peninsula, as well as sort of the city's sort of urban waterfront and commercial area, and then the Capitol Lake and Lower Deschutes watershed. And so what we did was we sort of developed a suite of strategies and applied them along these different reaches for both mid-century and end-of-century sea level rise projections. So we wanted to also be able to sort of communicate what these strategies look like on the ground to the public and the stakeholders. And so this is an example of one of the schematics that was developed along the Capitol Lake shoreline that shows sort of a raising and setback of the shoreline and how it integrates with the park area behind it. We looked at opportunities to incorporate living shoreline where the old seawall and path was. So a lot of interesting ideas there to sort of integrate the flood protection aspects and still maintain that public access. It's a very nice walking path along the waterfront there. This is a sort of an example of a long-term strategy. So one of the unique things or challenges in this project was that the city was really trying to look at what actions they could implement within the city right-of-way, as opposed to having to do things on private property. And so what that meant is that in some cases, the city right-of-way was actually set back a little bit from the shoreline. And so one of the things that we looked at here was essentially raising of the road to sort of act as a flood barrier and incorporate some more aspects such as multimodal use path within that raised profile. So the next project I'd like to talk about is some work that we did at the Port of Long Beach to develop a climate adaptation and coastal resiliency plan. And I want to mention this one because it includes both coastal and riverine flood hazards. So this was an assessment that we did for the port to satisfy a requirement from the state for entities that have granted public lands. They're required to conduct a sea level rise assessment, which includes looking at vulnerabilities, developing adaptation strategies through end of century, and also looking at the potential for economic impacts of sea level rise on their operations. And so one of the unique things about this project is that in addition to sort of doing that high level vulnerability and adaptation assessment, we also dove deeper into kind of 5 focus areas. So one was we looked at how the port could incorporate sea level rise into their harbor development permit process, and that's something that they've since implemented. The second was a combined coastal and riverine hazards study, which I'll discuss in just a second. And then the third was a coastal, the seawall replacement project along one of the piers there. So one of the things that we did, there was a channel that ran through the port here, and it was an interest in understanding sort of the performance of the levees and available freeboard in response to both sea level rise and changes in upstream hydrology. So what we did was we leveraged an existing HECRAS model and evaluated a number of different sea level rise scenarios for some of these kind of peak discharge events at 10, 50, and 100-year discharge. And we looked at both a 15% and 100% increase in the 100-year discharge and paired that with the changes in the downstream boundary condition with sea level rise, and looked at how the riverine flood profile changed in response to that at one of the key low spots along the channel. And what we found was that with that 36 inches of sea level rise and the 15% increase in 100-year discharge, there was a 1.9 foot, so about a 2-foot increase in the BFE. And so this is really interesting because I think that this sort of interaction and understanding the effect of sea level rise on the riverine flood profiles is something that has not been looked at a whole lot. And certainly when you look at a lot of the sea level rise inundation mapping that's being done, such as the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer or some of the inundation mapping that we've done in the San Francisco Bay Area, that sort of exacerbation of the riverine flood profile is something that's not shown on those maps. And so in some sense, it's sort of a missing piece of the hazard when people are looking at just the sea level rise map in these areas. And so I think that that's something that could be explored a little bit further to sort of round out our understanding of these hazards moving forward. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to Doug and see if there's any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Great presentation, a lot of really good work there. Clearly something that a lot of communities are going to have to deal with over the next couple of decades. I do see we have one question in the question box here. The question is, in your experience, how comfortable are people dealing with uncertainties associated with this type of work, and how do they handle them in terms of making decisions? Yeah,
that's a great question, and it comes up on a lot of the projects, not just in terms of, for example, how do you select a sea level rise scenario, or how do you select your future changes in precipitation, because when we look at the output from these models, in some cases, they may not even agree on the general trend of changes in precipitation, with some showing a positive and some showing a negative trend. And so really the way we handle that is to kind of look at a range of different potential scenarios in the analysis and mapping. And then really where you can handle it is in the adaptation plan, and understanding that the adaptation over the coming decades is going to be phased. We don't need to adapt to the highest climate scenarios today. And so the importance of sort of monitoring both changing environmental conditions as well as changing research and science, and sort of building that into the adaptation plan. So making sure you have the ability, you may do an initial build to say 12 inches of sea level rise, but have the ability to go to 24 inches of sea level rise if needed. And so I think that's kind of the primary way that people are thinking about it now, is sort of in that adaptation plan, and making sure that the strategies that are being identified are flexible, and that strategies that are being implemented in the near term don't sort of limit your options or preclude what you might be able to do later in the future.
Great, thanks. We've got another question that came in here about some of the TMAC recommendations. Were there any in the report that stuck out to you as maybe needing to be prioritized over others, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think the recommendation about demonstration projects is one that I think is really relevant, and we've seen a number. I didn't have a chance to review those case studies, but FEMA has conducted 4 demonstration projects across the country, looking at how to incorporate climate change into the analysis and mapping. And I think that we could use some more as well. And then also, moving beyond demonstration projects and actually trying to leverage and implement some of those methods that were developed would be a logical next step.
Great, and lastly, I have just a quick question for you. About what kind of frequency do you think people need to revisit these adaptation plans? I mean, do they typically set up a 5-year or 10-year or 2-year? In your experience, how often do they go back and relook at these kinds of things?
Yeah, well, I think we're sort of in a unique situation now because the science is really rapidly evolving. And we've even had projects where we started and there was sort of one state guidance with respect to sea level rise, and midway through the project, the guidance changed. And so, that's how rapidly it's evolving, that even over the course of a single project, you might be looking at different projections that you need to incorporate. And so I think what we're generally seeing is that our clients are sort of building into their plans that they would revisit sort of the vulnerability and adaptation plan on about a 5-year interval, which seems about right. You want it to be frequent enough that you can keep up with changing science, but you don't want it to be too frequent. So I think there's a balance there, but yeah, about a 5-year interval is what we're seeing some communities kind of adopting.
Great, thanks. We got one more question here and then we'll move on to Andy. I don't know if this is an attempt to stump you, but do you know where in the United States sea level is rising the greatest, the fastest, I guess?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated question because you both have the change in sea level, but really what exacerbates, I think, some of those local changes in sea level is the changes in the ground motion. And so areas that are experiencing the highest rates of subsidence are, I think, those areas that are sort of showing the highest rates of sea level rise. And so some of those areas along the Gulf Coast are seeing some of the highest rates of local sea level rise.
Great. Well, thank you, Justin. This has been a great presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time to present this to us and answer these questions. So next, we're gonna move on to Andy Bonner, and he's going to share some of the innovations in flood risk and flood hazard analytics and some of the opportunities these innovations present going into the future. So, Andy.
All right, quick sound check, Doug. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Great. Okay, well, thanks, Doug. Grateful to be with you all this morning. It's good to be connected in this way. My name is Andy Bonner. I am our riverine engineering practice lead within our Compass Technical Excellence program. I have the fortune, I guess, of working with FEMA headquarters on several initiatives. And I'm excited to talk to you today about some of the opportunities we're starting to see with regards to flood hazard and flood risk data as we start rolling forward. I think where I will begin is looking at the vision, or reviewing the vision that FEMA has set for all of us with regards to their future of flood risk data, or FFRD. By now, many of you have probably seen this before in one or two times, maybe in the same conference. But really, this was FEMA kind of establishing the objectives for all of us as we start to think about what the future of the flood hazard and flood risk data that are delivered within the program might look like. What are those driving principles that we should adhere to or consider? So we've been talking and we've heard about graduated hazard, graduated risk, making sure that there's still a consistent or significant role for all of us to play in the rollout of this. Making sure that as we transition towards this future environment that we're providing opportunities to increase and enhance some of the mitigation and insurance actions that are there, and also starting to anticipate some of the changes that we need to be all preparing for with regards to data management, data quality as we get farther along. So I think one other way to kind of consider this is for a very long time we've been producing data and products within at least the National Flood Insurance Program to meet the needs of an insurance stakeholder group, and rightfully so. That's kind of the name of the program itself. But we know that our goals and our aspirations are to be able to deliver data products that serve the needs of a broader range of stakeholders. And so part of the FFRD vision, part of the place where we are right now is to start thinking about what is the type of data, what's the foundation upon which we can deliver and meet the needs of this various stakeholder groups. That as we start processing that data or retrieving that data, analyzing that data, it starts to enable different applications, different possibilities, different opportunities within to meet the needs of these different stakeholder groups. So while today we're not really going to be spending much time talking about very specific tools or applications, we really want to focus on the data, that foundational layer that we're starting to see will enable us to meet the needs of these different stakeholder groups. So by now, whether again in this conference, last year, I think maybe even 2 years ago at ASFPM, we started to hear more and more discussion around probabilistic data. It's not a new concept, but there's been some exploration happening with regards to probabilistic data within the program. And so as that becomes more of a key element of the foundation that we're talking about here, it starts to open doors for us. It starts to create some opportunities. The data is unique, it's different, and just to highlight a few of those things, which again, this won't be a very technical discussion about probabilistic data. There's other presentations that will go into more detail on that, but it does cover a much wider range of analysis that we've been traditionally used to doing in our studies, from the very frequent to the very rare scenarios, covering more than just riverine flooding, at least from an inland standpoint, to pluvial, and multiple scenarios, high, low, medium precipitation values, different durations, different distributions. So hundreds to thousands of different analyses from which we can start to extract data and compile it in different and unique ways. But it's different from the firm, and I think it's we only have to overlay the two to really see some of those things start to stand out for us. One of the other big opportunities that we see with probabilistic data and some of the the future of what this might look like is finally being able to align how we talk about hazard and risk. I think for many years, myself personally, I sometimes tended to commingle the two, talking about hazard when I really was talking about risk, or talking about risk when I really was meant to be talking about hazard. And so, as we think about the opportunities here, we are closing in on a space where we can start aligning how we talk about it. And what I mean by that is, flood risk is more than just we start talking about flood risk itself, it is much more than just that one single event. It is looking at the spectrum of potential flooding scenarios. And this is really important from an actuarial perspective, certainly on an insurance side, to look at more than just that. Many of you will recall that the way we used to do mapping back in the old days was these A zone, A2, A4, A6. We had numbered A zones, which would give us some of those differences. So we start to see some of the distinctions between and the variation that exists in different areas of the floodplain. But with hazard data, we don't really do this, and that has some challenges if we really want to communicate the graduated nature of the hazard across the floodplain. So let's use the following example to explain a little bit more. So this is an example that if we want to start talking about and getting to the point of being able to discuss graduated risk, we really need to start with graduated hazard. That's kind of what everything is driven off of. So this is just a typical floodplain. We've seen over the years that we've transitioned from just a map with a boundary to maybe a little bit more resolution with depth grids and things like that, which show us some of that variation in the floodplain. But what about a scenario where we have two locations in our floodplain, maybe no more than a mile from one another, probably even closer than that, and at the quote unquote 100-year flood depth, it's 2 feet at that location. Again, this is hazard. This is regardless of whatever structure might be built there. So divorce ourselves for a moment between, if there's a building there, is it 1 story, is it 2 story? Let's just look at the hazard itself. So if the depth of those locations is 2 feet deep, and we want to be able to communicate graduated hazard, would we be led to assume that the hazard's about the same between the two? So we can start maybe thinking about the complications or challenges of just using one particular event. So if we start looking at maybe more frequent events, the 25-year in this case, we see that it's actually deeper at point A than it is in point B. So would we be led to maybe assume that the hazard is greater at A than it is B? Well, what about the more rare events, the less frequent events? Now we see that it's actually deeper at B than it is in A. So does this skew us on the other side to think that maybe is the hazard actually worse at B than it is in A? So we go through that exercise, and you could debate that all day long with yourself. But ultimately, from a probabilistic standpoint, the value that it gives us is it allows us to analyze the range of flooding scenarios and frequencies and probabilities across a wide spectrum of scenarios. And then we can finally get to the first type of graduated hazard product, which tells us some of the story, more of the story, I would say, but still maybe incomplete. And that is the annual exceedance probabilities. This is, again, nothing new. It's not a concept that's new. And we can start seeing when different points within that floodplain flood, or the probability at which they floods at about the same time, or about the same probability, as point A. The difference, though, is that at point C, it never gets more than about a foot and a half, maybe 2 feet deep, whereas in these other locations, in the more frequent, or sorry, the less frequent event, the rarer events, that actually gets deeper. So all that being said, we now, through a probabilistic approach, have that range of scenarios. We have the spectrum of potential flooding scenarios at any given location, at all locations within the floodplain. And from that, we can extend that same concept to a graduated flood depth, where we're looking at, instead of just one particular spot, we're looking at the range across the entire floodplain and across the entire spectrum of scenarios. So we can do the same thing with velocity. We start to see that reveals other things about the hazard that we haven't traditionally been accounting for. And lo and behold, at B, we start to see that it's actually about twice as, water's moving about twice as fast as the other location. So all that being said, this kind of graduated depth, this graduated velocity concept, we can start to see opportunities to combine those two into some kind of graduated flood hazard process, or graduated flood hazard data or product itself. And whether we slice this up into 4 or 5 or 3 different classifications, whether we call it one thing or the other, is less important for now than it is to just know that we have the ability to, from a graduated hazard perspective, start to show in a map view the horizontal variation that exists within the floodplain. We also have a lot of information that allows us, from a vertical perspective, or more than just horizontally, being able to depict that hazard and risk doesn't stop at the line, it continues on. But from a vertical perspective, how different elevations affect different things. So that leads us all back to this point and where we started from. So what is the role that that you and I can play in helping to advance this vision, and what are some of those opportunities we're starting to see. So I'm going to illustrate maybe one additional concept related to graduated data, and start looking at that, the opportunities there from a site or community level perspective. And then I'm going to pull in some of my other colleagues. Marcia Tobin is going to talk a little bit about the opportunities with regards to mitigation that we're starting to see. John Dorman is going to talk about enhancing the data. What can we bring to this process from a local or state perspective, especially with regards to disaster response and recovery. And then we'll conclude with Hope Morgan and Jennifer Moss talking about some of the changes that we should all start anticipating with regards to data management, quality, community due process related to digital data. So the first example, going back, hopefully many of you may have started to think about the opportunities and consider this particular scenario. But in the past, we've been basing almost everything. The program's been built around the 1%. And so, of course, when we talk about higher standards, we're talking about BFE plus freeboard. However, we start to see, and many of you will know this, that BFE plus a foot, let's say, means something very different depending on where you are. We just go back to those same two locations we viewed, and it's actually closer to a 400 year at point B, and maybe a 10,000 year that BFE plus a foot. So it starts to allow us the ability to maybe normalize the elevations and the standards at which we kind of guide new development and new construction across the community. That's just one simple example we see of this data from a community perspective. Before I transition actually to Marcia, I'd be remiss to say, that we're talking a lot about riverine right now. Cheryl Johnson, who's our coastal engineering practice lead within our Compass Technical Excellence program, if you want to see some ideas and examples with regards to from a coastal perspective and what the future might hold, I encourage you to go back and view, if you didn't already, session C1, where she talks about some of those. So with that, I'll transition over to Marcia to talk about some of the mitigation opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here today. Appreciate all of you being with us. I know this is a strange format, but everybody's getting used to it. So my name is Marcia Tobin. I'm an urban planner, and I have a background in climate and environmental science. I work with communities across the country, many sizes, and the focus is to build greater resilience to hazards and changing climate conditions. And for our technical excellence program, I lead the customer experience domain. Our focus is really on who is using data, the FEMA data and products, how it's being used, and how that can be expanded to further reduce risk and resilience. So in this first slide at the top, I'm sure all of you are well aware, Americans have experienced a devastating number of natural disasters, especially over the last 40 years. In the top chart, which is data from NOAA, this shows the total number of billion-dollar events per year since 1980, the types of events and the cost of those. So the numbers are increasing, the costs are increasing, and a large part of that, as you can see in the blue bars and green bars, are inland flooding and severe storms, which are much larger parts of the total each year. On the bottom is a summary of the objectives of the National Mitigation Investment Strategy, which was released last year. And this is a single national strategy to advance mitigation investment. So the combination of increasing number of billion-dollar events, large events that are affecting more and more people, and a national mitigation investment strategy creates a really perfect atmosphere, environment in which we want to be looking at how can we use the probabilistic data for expanding the reduction of risk throughout the nation. So on our next slide, I wanted to take an example of the hazard mitigation process for the BRIC program, which is the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program. And a key intent of this program is to invest in a wide variety of mitigation activities, including things such as large community-wide public infrastructure projects, as well as to push the innovative approaches such as partnerships, multiple sources of funding, and design solutions throughout an entire project. So in addition to risk reduction, the strategy is looking to offer multiple benefits to the community. So as we look at this process, you can see that there are several places where we can implement and integrate probabilistic data into the mitigation process. So the stars on this, so in the beginning at the vulnerability assessment process, when we're looking at what extent are hazards and risks, where are they, to what extent do they exist? And then what are the key mitigation needs? So how would those, what do each of these projects need in order to reduce the risk that they're looking at or they're facing? And then further, as a project is implemented, this data can be used to inform design decisions and solutions so that you can improve, for example, optimize your benefit cost ratio, optimize the amount of money that's being invested for reducing as much risk as possible. And then at the end of the process or after a project is implemented, this data can be used to monitor progress. So how successful was it? How many losses were avoided and to what extent? So this can be used as a good check on that, on the effectiveness of these projects. So as you can see, there's multiple places where this data can be used, and we're very excited about the opportunity to work with many stakeholders in developing it further and to increase the amount of adaptation that's being employed across the nation. So I'm now going to pass it on to John Dorman, who's going to speak further on hazard mitigation. Thanks very much. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Marcia. Just want to do a sound check. Hear me, Andy?
Yep, can hear you fine, John.
Great. Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope all of you on the Zoom are happy and healthy. I'm John Dorman. I'm one of the vice presidents of the Disaster Resilience Group with AECOM, and I'm focusing mostly on emergency management and risk management. So I don't know about you, but lost opportunity, I hate the term, especially when opportunity has great value, that the effort to gain that value is really not that difficult. In fact, I wouldn't even use the term difficult. With that being said, just one of the many opportunities for partnering and, more importantly, adding value, I'd like to talk about this morning, and that's in the emergency management area. Over my last 20 years, I've been blessed, or whatever you want to call it, being fully immersed in both flood risk management and disaster emergency management. From this experience, and more specifically with hurricanes such as Matthew and Florence, several truths have been ingrained in my head. One is that flood hazard mapping is truly the foundation for collaboration between flood risk and disaster response and recovery. In addition, added value data is the bridge between the two disciplines, and more importantly, it's the enabler for added value opportunity. As noted, and you can see the first column here of data, there is a wealth of data that's been generated through the National Flood Mapping Program. And that data needs to be leveraged and harnessed. And you can see the different types of data, H&H modeling, both riverine and coastal inundation, different grids. There's a lot of data that's there. But just to share with you, in the late 1990s, and it's actually accelerated in 2000, technology has just given all of us the opportunity to further enable the acquisition and sharing of data. And you can see in that second column, much of that data, LIDAR, parcel, policies, modeling that allows for damage curves. And then, as Andy mentioned this morning, even more so, the probabilistic flood elevations. Most of this information, though, is collected not at the national level, but between states, locals, and private sector organizations, and is typically done for other purposes. But this enables us right now in a sunny day setting to develop structures, first floor elevations, the actual identification of infrastructure, actual synthetic population models. All of that enables us to do structure-specific impacts. And that truly can be done on a sunny day. But remember, I said I hate lost opportunity. And that opportunity really comes about when we've all had this, disasters occur. And with the ability to have situational intelligence, you are able to actually be a part of the reduction of loss of life and property. By having the added value data on the risk side and tying that to situational intelligence, in the state I was working in, we were actually able to provide real-time and forecasted impacts at the structure level. And so with that being said, what was able to come out of that, Andy, if you'll flip to the next one, we were able to actually tell the State Emergency Operations Center which actual structures were going to be impacted and how deep the flooding would be. We were able to share at the building level the population and which of those populations would be flooded, tying that to special needs associated with that population. After the event, we were able to show where the hot spots were down to a 1 square mile grid so that search and rescue could go out and work on those rescues. We were actually able to provide structure-specific damage assessments, and we were actually able to provide when properties should evacuate or not. That also led into the ability to, before an event even occurred or before it even left the state, the ability to provide data-driven funding requests associated with CDBG, with FEMA HMGP, with congressional. So with all of that being said, I would encourage and really advocate that each of you can do this working together with local, state, and even federal entities, as well as private sector, to take this added value data and not miss the opportunity. Remember, you want to hate the missed opportunity, utilize it. And I would just say that AECOM, of course, is certainly willing to sit down with you and work through that plan. So thank you. And I'll pass it on now to Hope Morgan.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the AECOM Showcase. Thank you so much for letting us be here. And I'm very excited to talk about a fundamental truth. You've heard it from everyone that has discussed this, and that is the data behind all of these decision making. I am leading up the geospatial tier for the Technical Excellence Program, and data is something I'm very passionate about. So there's just some baseline things that I want to talk about. And one is planning is key. As John just spoke to, federal partners are spending a lot of time trying to make sure that they are coordinating across the groups, and that really needs to happen at a local level as well. As many people as you can bring into the process at the local level is going to be a key to show the federal partners that you're really in for the long haul and you're really ready to show what's available. One thing that's great though is as key stakeholders become available for this data sets, it means that we're not duplicating effort and we are sharing that information across the group. Now, data is not magic. It is a fundamental baseline, but you can look like you're magic when you're creating all of these different products. We want to be part of the conversation for the beginning of the data. You want to know what the plan is for that being produced so that you can make sure that any fundamental parts of the baseline information are being collected as they should be. And what that means is that you have an exponential growth of possibilities, as have been shown by Andy and by others, for what information you can produce out of these data sets. Next slide, please. Large data sets is what you end up with, where once upon a time we had a floodplain boundary and a nice paper map. Now we have databases full of information. We have 1, 5, 20 raster data sets for statewide projects. So we want to make sure that we know what the system investment is for all of that data. But one great thing to look for in the future is that the possibilities are changing. And that's things like cloud-based change, where you're going to have processing capabilities that you didn't have before, or where you're going to have data storage that's pennies on the dollar. So these are things that we're really looking for. The timeline of data is also very important. We know that data is a static moment in time, but depending on these different data sets, as John spoke to, you really can see that for a terrain data set, it may only be updated 5-10 years. You may be able to use the same data set over a long period of time, but for some of these more localized sets, parcel information, population, these things need to change at a more consistent level. And some places it's being done, and some places it's not. But again, what these possibilities tell us is we're going to be aware of what those timelines are and how we're going to use those. And I'm going to say it, metadata is your key. We're going to make sure that we know what that information is, and we're moving forward. So quality is the next big thing I want to talk about. We want to make sure we understand what the quality is of our data. There are a ton of specifications at the federal level. We know who the key stakeholders are, and if you don't understand or you're not quite sure that those specifications are working for you, you can be part of that change. And that is true at the local level as well. We want to make sure we understand and are a part of the conversation of what the quality level is of our data. And with that, I pass it to Jennifer Moss.
Great. Thank you, Hope. I hope everyone can hear me this morning. Good morning, and thank you for joining the AECOM team. My name is Jennifer Moss, and I'm coming to you live from Fort Worth, Texas. I really wish I could be welcoming you all to my city and show you what a great place Fort Worth is. I know you don't love how walkable, friendly, and lively the city is. And for those of you ready for summer, our weather's perfect this week. Clear skies, low humidity, which is rare, and temperatures in the high 80s and 90s. I'm the due process technical excellence lead for Compass and leader in due process post-preliminary procedures, planning, and solutions for AECOM. Sounds like a mouthful. Our goal is to provide our teams solutions and support that increase regulatory confidence. We've heard from my AECOM colleagues this morning how climate change, future hazards, probabilistic hazard and risk are driving opportunities and needs. And Hope led us in a great discussion on the opportunities and challenges in managing all this data. We may think of due process as being static, but I want to challenge that notion today and focus on the opportunities to modernize in the realm of delivery. When we talk about due process, we mean those regulatory activities leading up to and immediately following the 90 days appeal period, which allows communities and anyone who believes their property rights have been adversely affected the opportunity to officially respond and provide scientific and technical data to FEMA that contradicts or negates FEMA's proposed flood hazard determinations. Today's world, it's presenting us with some challenges, shifts in not only how we work and now attend conferences, but also how we deliver products and services. Modernizing delivery and due process domain presents some challenges and opportunities. First off, could we go digital, and would it work? The USPS certified mail requirement continues to present challenges for notification and delivery and confirmation of those appeal start materials we send to communities. Modernizing delivery methods would require legislation changes, as the Code of Federal Regulations requires we provide due process notification via USPS certified mail. There's no FedEx, DHL, UPS, it's straight up USPS certified mail. But to answer, does digital delivery work? Well, we can look to other community notification requirements. BW12, for example. BW12 established that community notification and comment period must take place during various phases of the flood insurance study process. But what BW12 did not do was regulate how that notification should be delivered. So unlike appeal starts and in due processing, where we have that regulatory requirement for USPS, we've got flexibility. And as a result, we're seeing communities, states, and regions embrace the notification and sharing of data for this requirement via electronic means. Communities are responding electronically. But the data delivery option goes beyond the need to meet BW12 requirements. An exciting opportunity that Compass has had, unfortunately, due to the shelter in place, we as a Compass team had to engage with communities, the CTP, state and region to complete the first digital distribution of preliminary data. With everybody's buy-in, we went digital for the first time, and it was so successful and well received that there's plans in the works for future digital distributions of that data. As I noted earlier, going digital for due process delivery would require legislative changes. But is legislative change on the horizon in the due process domain? We can look to the 2019 proposed amendments to the National Flood Insurance Act as one example. One of the significant changes proposed in 2019 was to remove the requirement for the publication in the Federal Register, creating opportunities to move studies along and establish those due process rights sooner. Another change proposed was adding the ability to move forward panels not impacted by appeals, giving FEMA the ability to get risk information into the hands of those who need it sooner rather than later. We've all seen how studies can be tied up. So while this bill wasn't passed in 2019 for the reauthorization of the NFIP, it's one example of attempts for change and helps demonstrate that due process is anything but static. So on behalf of the AECOM Future Flood Risk Data Team coming to you live this morning, thank you. And I'd now like to welcome Doug Bellamo back to our virtual AECOM showcase stage.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, others. Great presentation. Obviously, a lot of really interesting things on the horizon with respect to hazard identification and mitigation investments and due process and emergency management. I've got a couple of questions that have come up here. The first, I think, straddles between Andy and John a little bit. The question is, how might this probabilistic data be used as flood events are unfolding? So maybe one of you has some thoughts on that.
Sure, John, maybe I'll take a first crack at it and then toss it over to you. So I think one of the great opportunities that we're seeing is because in a probabilistic world, we have analyzed such a wide range of possible flooding scenarios that the hope is, and I would say we're maybe even more than cautiously optimistic. We're optimistic that when there is a disaster, whether pending or after it just occurred, the anticipation is that there will be at least one of those scenarios that we would have analyzed in an area that would match closely to the real observed flooding situation that occurred on the ground. And so, with that the case, the anticipation is that we'd be able to go into the database, essentially that's there, extract from that database the scenario that most closely represents the actual disaster, and then carry it forward to all the other things that John talked about: risk, damage assessments, etc. John, anything else you want to add to that?
Sure, Andy, and that's a great point, because having data driven funding requests are very important, and by having an actual understanding of what really happened gives you the ability to come back and provide a financial loss that supports that. But I would also say, by having this probabilistic flood elevations, it allows you, as the gauge goes up and down and you have an elevation, to match back to where the water will be. An inch, 2 inches in a house is significantly different in some cases, as well as on top of a road. So it gives you a much, much more accurate understanding of where you need to be in response and who might be in need of support. So it's a great value to have.
Excellent, thank you. Marcia, I've got a question here about monitoring actual benefits. It seems important to be monitoring these benefits after some of these projects go in. Is that an expensive endeavor to watch these projects perform afterward, or what?
Well, it definitely depends on the project itself. I would say, it's easy to use this data to look at how a project, it's all about how the project itself is set up. So if going into it, it's more of an adaptive management process, or we've got a mitigation project, let's see how that works. There's some aspects of it that may be changed or tweaked, so you can kind of build that into the process. Depends on the size of the project, depends on how many factors, how widely it's being impacted. So hard to say really if that's going to be expensive or not, but like many things, planning ahead for it can help to anticipate that. And then I think the ease of being able to use some of this data from you don't have to necessarily be on the ground, but actually running the data remotely can reduce some of those costs as well. And then Andy, you might have some further thoughts on that. I don't know.
No, I think that's great. I mean, I think when we're looking at benefits and costs, it really is driven off of the risk data that you have, or the ability to compute risk, benefits in terms of what the risk was before the project, what the risk is after the project, and in the most simple of terms, the net difference between the two is some of the benefits, and being able to compare that to cost of the project. I think we certainly see opportunities there.
Great. I've got two more questions. Andy, is the analysis focused on quantifying risk or communicating hazards?
Yeah, so I think I took the tack to talk about the hazard first and foremost, recognizing that once you have a good understanding of the hazard and all its permutations and all of the different scenarios, then the jump from that to risk is actually fairly straightforward. Sure, there's some decisions to be made in terms of at what flood depth translates to this amount of damage and those kind of things. But generally speaking, the bulk of the efforts around flood hazard identification. So once you get that, then that translates to our ability to communicate communicate risk in different ways, aggregating that across multiple structures, doing it one at a time. The real value is that the data lends itself to giving a picture from a zoomed out level, community-wide level of what the hazards generally are across the community, but also refined enough to where if I'm curious about a specific location, an individual structure, a lot that I may want to develop on, how can I avoid or minimize that risk going forward, that the data lends itself to that. So it certainly covers both hazard and risk.
Great, thank you. And the last question here, I think again, is for you, Andy. What are some of the biggest challenges in producing some of this data?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of those challenges have been met head on over the past 2 years, and a lot of exploration and effort has gone on that FEMA has really gotten out ahead of this and look to identify what those challenges are and address them. I think some of the challenges that were perceived challenges at the beginning of this, you've got to do, we're talking more than just 5 analyses. If you're doing a 2D model, boy, a 2D model takes 5 hours to run. Now you're telling me I've got to do 1,000 of these. Some of the cloud technology has really minimized that as a particular challenge. I think ultimately, and it's not unique to probabilistic, it's as we transition into this type of analysis and wanting to provide credible data in urban areas, it's accounting for a way in an urban setting to make sure that what we're depicting is reflective of the scenario. And so, really kind of illuminates the need to work closely with locals who understand the local infrastructure there in place to make sure that's properly represented. But really the challenges that maybe were perceived challenges are less and less now. And I think it's one of the things that we're excited about.
That's great. Thanks, Andy. So next we're going to move on to Laura Adleman. She's going to share with us some of the newer technologies with respect to engagement in this era of social distancing. So I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Doug. All right. Just a minute here and we'll get going. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us at the showcase. I'm Laura Adleman, and I'm a Senior Outreach and Engagement Specialist based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm also leading stakeholder engagement for the Compass Technical Excellence Program that you heard about earlier. So I'm going to talk about virtual engagement, which now seems to be our new normal here in the era of social distancing. And, you know, we've all seen what's been an almost overnight shift in the approach to outreach from in-person to online. And one of the things that we've done to help adjust to this and to provide resources is to help develop what we're calling a toolkit for the times. So we know that outreach is often a critical path item for many of our projects, and our project schedules are actually dependent on outreach. No matter if we're talking about a flood study or a levee project or really any other type of planning project, you know, it's more important now than ever to keep our projects moving forward despite these very challenging and unusual times. A virtual engagement program is really going to help provide our stakeholders with a method to stay involved and keep up to date and participate in our public involvement process from their own homes, and also keep our engagement even more effective now. There's some new tools in virtual engagement, or at least new to some of us, but really those of us in the outreach world have been using a lot of these social distancing friendly tools for quite some time as part of our overall communications programs. But what's really new for all of us is using exclusively these online or virtual engagement tools. So I'm going to go over some of them, and hopefully that will give you some options as you may be developing your outreach programs now. So before I get into the different tools, I'd like to go over some key planning considerations for an engagement program. So to begin with, this is really hopefully meant to help you decide what might be the right tools for your project. So what information do we need to share, and what format does that really need to take? And secondly, what feedback is going to help us inform our outreach process? And who is our target audience for engagement? Who are we really looking to share that information with? And lastly, and perhaps most importantly now during these times, do our participants need to converge, or can they participate at their own time, at their own convenience? And for example, that really means, do we need to set up a virtual meeting that people need to participate in at one time, or can we perhaps set up a site that people can look at on their own time? This is really going to help define what tools you may find most useful. So first, I wanted to point out an engagement microsite. This is building a temporary standalone site that really allows you to pull over the information that you might have used at, say, an open house style meeting, things like boards and fact sheets and that kind of thing, other types of materials, and pulling them into the virtual space. This type of format doesn't necessarily allow you with two-way types of communication, but you can put different types of things like comment tools and surveys alongside your relevant content. You can also include things like narrated PowerPoints or videos alongside that relevant content to try and keep it a little bit more interactive. So we're all familiar with meeting platforms like Zoom and WebEx and Teams or Teams live events for our business meeting purposes, but now we're starting to transition to use these for virtual meetings for our stakeholder engagement or our public meetings. And so they all have different features, different pros and cons, and different benefits that you may want to consider as you're developing what might be right for your project. Things to consider are moderator controls, pre-registration, and the level of interactivity you may want to have with your participants. So these are things to keep in mind as you're developing your outreach process. So social media outreach has been around a long time, both in the form of content and paid advertising. Facebook and Instagram Live have really become very popular, though recently in the era of COVID-19 and social distancing, particularly by elected officials and public health officials. We've seen them use these forces for their daily briefings to give updates. They're really harnessing the power of these videos to expand their reach and tap into existing audiences and expand into new audiences as well. The benefit here is that you can record these videos, save them for later viewing as well, and post them to different websites, and broaden into new followers as well. So it's a really powerful tool to consider. Now on to some other mobile-friendly platforms that you may want to think about. These are multi-tool engagement platforms. Social Pinpoint is a customizable community engagement platform. This can take many of the exercises you would have done during something like a charrette or other open house style meeting in person. It has the capability for things like surveys or interactive mapping, even things like idea walls or budget exercises, and moves that into the virtual space. Public input is another one that's activated into the mobile environment. It has some really easy templates for startup as well, and lets you do social media campaigns and the like. MetroQuest is one that you may have heard of or may have even used on your projects. This is a focused engagement platform. It allows you to create 5 different modules on these various screens. It's very interactive and highly visual, so I think it allows for more participant feedback and gives you the ability to get really specific feedback during different project milestones, especially for like design projects. It's a great tool. Survey tools, we all get a lot of surveys, we've all taken surveys, but this is a great way to get online feedback. A lot of different platforms out there to think about. They all have different capabilities to collect comments. SurveyMonkey is a really popular one. It has a lot of different functions, allows you to include images and maps. Typeform has a little bit more basic functionality, but is also a lower cost if you are interested in that for your project. I also wanted to mention accessibility is something that's very important to consider during these times. While we are all thinking about virtual engagement as something that's very important, you may not be able to rely on that exclusively right now. It still is important to consider your location of your project and what your target audience is, and ability to access technology if everyone may or may not have that. So you may still need to think about some more traditional tools. Everydoor Direct is a service available through the United States Postal Service. You can really target your mailing and specify which mail routes you're interested in. They also do the actual printing and mailing, which is very handy right now as access to print services may be a little bit more limited. A telephone town hall is another good one to consider. You set the parameters for a geographic location that you want to call out to, and all the participants have to do is dial 0 or 1 to be connected directly to the town hall. And people can ask questions just using their phone, or in some cases using text messaging. A lot of elected officials we've seen use this format to stay in touch with constituents during the COVID-19 crisis. So it has also become very popular and useful. And lastly, I wanted to focus on our brand new AECOM developed virtual open house tool. This is a very exciting addition to our outreach toolbox. It really gives you the look and feel of being and attending an open house in person. You get into what feels like a virtual room, and you can pan around and click on different icons that take you to things like poster boards and videos, virtual reality, maps and images, fact sheets, surveys or comment forms, and other links within the room. So it is a great tool. And right now we're actually using it for a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project. That's the image you're seeing here. And we're also using it for our booth here at ASFPM. Hopefully some of you have gotten a chance to visit our booth. And if you haven't, I'd encourage you to do so. A lot of our experts here that you've seen presenting are going to be there right after this presentation, and will be available to answer any questions you may have. So very quickly, I would like to give you a quick demo of our booth. So give me just a minute and I will switch over to that. Here we are. So as I mentioned, when you arrive at our booth, you can just pan around it and click on some different icons. We've got some poster boards here, some information on flooding and on our mapping. We've got some videos here on AECOM services. Continue panning around and you'll find a link to some other projects that we're using the virtual room for. We've got a link here to our Zoom room where you can find many of our experts available to answer your questions. And we've also got a form here that you can submit your feedback. And if you do that, we'd love to hear from you. You will be entered to win a prize. So that also is a great thing. And another video here about AECOM services. So again, this is our AECOM virtual open house tool. I'd encourage all of you to check it out. And with that, I think we are ready to take some questions.
Great, Laura, thank you. Clearly, a lot of progress in this area over the last couple of months for sure. One question here is, how might these methods or tools you just discussed with us shape engagements post-COVID? So hopefully some vaccines will be produced at some point. Life will be a little bit more normal than it is right now. Any thoughts on how some of these technologies might be deployed after that?
Yeah, well, good question. I think that we are in this for the long haul in terms of virtual engagement. Some of these tools have been around a long time, and I think they'll continue to be around in terms of virtual engagement. The mobile platforms, for example, and survey tools, we've certainly been doing that for a long time. But in terms of virtual meetings, I also think that from what we've been hearing from agencies at the local level in particular, virtual meetings, I think, are here to stay. I don't think anyone's in a big hurry to go back to the in-person meeting. For better or worse, I think it's going to be a while before we go back to that meeting format. So I think, we're all kind of adjusting to how that's going to work, but and sort of supplementing what we used to do in person and figuring out, ways to kind of get around that and continue to do multiple forms of outreach to make sure we're reaching everyone. But yeah, I really feel like the virtual engagement and all the tools we're coming across now, and even more to come, that's something that's here to stay.
Great, thank you, Laura. And we don't have any other questions for you, but I do want to say thank you to all of our technical experts. Clearly, there's a lot to look forward to in terms of opportunities going forward. And so also want to thank the audience thank you for taking the time to join us today. Laura has brought up here all of our contact information. And so if you do have any follow-on questions or want to get in touch with us, if you quickly screen capture that, you'll have all of our email addresses, and please send us an email, give us feedback, ask questions, what have you. And so as we wrap up here, I guess one thing I'd like to do is just kind of double down on the message that we all need to be working this flood risk management challenge together. Like I said, no one's an island on this. Flood risk is something we're going to have to manage across jurisdictional boundaries, across disciplines. And so let's keep staying sharp and staying focused and reduce risks for the nation. With that, stay safe. Please check out our booth. All of our experts here today will be there. You can drop into a Zoom meeting and ask questions. We really do appreciate you taking the time to be with us, and be safe and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.